"You're too quiet, Harold. Nobody cares about old ghosts," his wife once hissed, a worn vet fading into the streets, blind to the chaos one bus ride would spark. That hot afternoon, he faced sneers and shoves from strangers, clutching his badge as shame burned deep. Days later, dark sedans rolled up silently, their shadows whispering threats from a past he couldn't escape. Hello everyone. Welcome to Narrative Whispers. Today I'm going to tell you another heartwarming story, so let's dive into it. The afternoon sun filtered through the grimy windows of the number 42 bus as it rumbled down Madison Avenue. The vehicle was packed with the usual mix of commuters, office workers with loosened ties, students with backpacks slung over their shoulders, and shoppers laden with bags. As the bus lurched to a stop at the corner of 5th Street, an elderly man climbed aboard, his movements slow and deliberate. His clothes were worn and frayed, his white beard unkempt, and his eyes, a faded blue, seemed to carry the weight of decades. He fumbled in his pocket for change, coins clinking together, as he dropped them one by one into the fare box. "Could you hurry it up, old man?" someone called from the back of the bus, impatience lacing their words. "Some of us have places to be." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, but the elderly man didn't seem to notice. He simply nodded at the driver, who gave him a tight-lipped smile, before shuffling down the aisle in search of a seat. The bus was nearly full, with most passengers averting their eyes as he passed, some pulling their bags closer as if protecting them from contamination. Finally, he spotted an empty seat near the middle and lowered himself onto it with a quiet sigh of relief. The woman sitting beside him immediately wrinkled her nose and shifted closer to the window, creating as much distance between them as the narrow seat would allow. She exchanged glances with the businessman across the aisle, who rolled his eyes in a show of mutual disdain. "They really should have separate transportation for these people," the woman muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I pay good money to ride this bus. I shouldn't have to share it with someone who hasn't seen soap and water in weeks." Her words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, but the old man kept his gaze fixed on his weathered hands resting in his lap. Robert Chin had been watching the scene unfold from his seat 3 rows back. At 35, he considered himself a reasonable man, pragmatic and not given to emotional outbursts. He worked in finance, lived in a penthouse apartment, and generally avoided involving himself in other people's business. But something about the casual cruelty directed at the elderly man made his jaw clench. He watched as others on the bus either nodded in agreement with the woman or pretended not to notice what was happening. The old man himself remained silent, his shoulders slightly hunched as if to make himself smaller, less noticeable. "Excuse me." A gruff voice broke the uncomfortable silence. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit stood up, his face flushed with what appeared to be righteous indignation. "Sir, I think you should get off at the next stop. This is a public bus for decent citizens, not a shelter for vagrants." He gestured dismissively at the elderly man, whose eyes widened slightly at being directly addressed. The businessman continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "Look at you, dirtying up the seats that my tax dollars pay to maintain. Do you think that's fair to the rest of us? Do you?" The elderly man opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. He looked around the bus, perhaps searching for a friendly face, but was met with either hostile stares or carefully averted gazes. The businessman, emboldened by the lack of opposition, stepped closer. "I said you need to get off this bus. Now." He reached out, his hand closing around the old man's thin arm, ready to physically remove him from his seat. The elderly man flinched at the contact, his face a mask of confusion and hurt, but he made no move to resist. Robert couldn't sit by any longer. "Hey!" he called out, rising from his seat. "Take your hands off him." The businessman turned, surprised at the interruption. Robert moved forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't usually one for confrontation, but this was crossing a line he couldn't ignore. "He has just as much right to be here as any of us. Let him go." The businessman hesitated, looking around for support, but Robert's intervention had created a crack in the collective indifference. A few other passengers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of their passive participation in this small act of cruelty. "Mind your own business," the businessman snapped, but his grip on the elderly man's arm loosened slightly. "You want to defend this bum? Look at him. He probably hasn't worked a day in his life, living off handouts while the rest of us contribute to society." The elderly man lowered his head, shame coloring his cheeks. As he did so, something fell from his pocket, clattering to the floor of the bus. The sound momentarily silenced the businessman, who looked down to see what had fallen. There, gleaming dully against the dirty bus floor, lay a military veteran's badge. Time seemed to freeze as all eyes fixed on the small metal emblem. Robert bent down and picked it up, carefully brushing off the dust before examining it. The badge was old but well preserved, the insignia unmistakable. This man had served in Vietnam. "Sir," Robert said quietly, holding the badge out to the elderly man, "I believe this is yours." The old man nodded, reaching out with trembling fingers to reclaim his possession. Their eyes met briefly, and Robert saw not just gratitude but a quiet dignity that transcended his shabby appearance. "You're a veteran?" the businessman asked, his voice now stripped of its previous contempt. The change was almost comical, from aggressive certainty to faltering doubt in the span of seconds. The elderly man nodded again, tucking the badge safely back into his pocket. "Korea first," he said, his voice surprisingly clear despite its softness. "Then 2 tours in Vietnam. Name's Harold Winters, 101st Airborne Division." He didn't elaborate further, didn't defend himself or demand respect. He simply stated the facts, as if they were either a source of pride nor shame, merely the truth of his existence. A uncomfortable silence descended on the bus. The businessman's face had drained of color, and he took a step back, releasing Harold's arm completely. The woman who had complained earlier stared fixedly out the window, suddenly fascinated by the passing cityscape. Robert remained standing, unsure of what to do next. The driver called out the next stop, and the bus began to slow down. Harold Winters reached up and pulled the cord, signaling his intention to disembark. "This is my stop," he said simply, gathering his worn canvas bag from the floor. He stood up, his movements betraying the stiffness of old joints, and made his way toward the door without looking back. Robert found himself following, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite name. As Harold stepped off the bus and onto the sidewalk, Robert called out, "Mr. Winters." "Wait, please." The elderly man turned, surprise evident on his weathered face. Behind them, the bus doors closed with a hiss, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, carrying its load of chastened passengers back into the anonymity of the city. "I'm Robertson," he said, extending his hand. Harold hesitated for a moment before taking it, his grip surprisingly firm despite his age. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about what happened back there." Harold shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "No need to apologize, son. You weren't the one causing trouble." He gazed down the street, his eyes reflecting the golden afternoon light. "People see what they want to see. Can't blame them, really. I know how I look these days." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a quiet acceptance that somehow made Robert feel even worse about the situation. He found himself wondering what series of events had led this man, who had served his country, who had likely seen horrors Robert could scarcely imagine, to this point, standing on a street corner in threadbare clothes with nowhere to go. "Do you live around here, Mr. Winters?" Robert asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Harold gestured vaguely toward the east. "I move around," he said simply. "Shelter on 10th takes me in when it's cold, park bench when it's warm. VA check comes first of the month, get a room for a few days then." He spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity, as if describing someone else's life rather than his own. Robert felt a knot forming in his throat. He passed by homeless people countless times, dropped the occasional dollar in a cup, perhaps, but never really stopped to think about their stories, their pasts, the paths that had led them to the streets. The businessman from the bus suddenly appeared beside them, his face flushed with what might have been exertion or embarrassment. "Mr. Winters," he said, slightly out of breath, "I need to apologize for my behavior. It was inexcusable." Harold turned to face him, his expression neutral. "Not necessary," he replied, his voice steady. "You weren't wrong about how I look. Been a while since I've had access to proper facilities." The businessman, Roger Blackwell, according to the name badge clipped to his suit jacket, shook his head vehemently. "No, that's no excuse. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I'm ashamed of myself." A gust of wind swept down the street, carrying with it the first hint of evening chill. Harold pulled his thin jacket closer around his shoulders, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by either Robert or Roger. The three men stood there, an unlikely trio on the busy sidewalk, as pedestrians flowed around them like water around rocks in a stream. "Where were you headed, Mr. Winters?" Robert asked finally, breaking the awkward silence. Harold shrugged. "Nowhere in particular, just riding to stay warm for a bit. Libraries close at 5 on Thursdays." Roger cleared his throat, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture. Look, Mr. Winters, I know this might sound strange coming from someone who just tried to throw you off a bus, but I'd like to help, if you'll let me. He glanced at Robert, as if seeking support, then continued. I live just a few blocks from here. My wife makes a mean pot roast, and we have a spare bedroom that no one's using. It's not much, but it's warm and clean, and you'd be welcome to stay as long as you need to. The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and sincere. Harold stared at Roger for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Why would you do that? He asked finally, his voice tinged with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. You don't know me. Roger shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable but determined. Because I was wrong, he said simply. Because you served our country while I was still in diapers. Because it's the decent thing to do. He paused, then added more quietly. And because my father was in Vietnam too, 173rd Airborne. He didn't make it back. Robert watched as something passed between the two men, a silent understanding, a shared history that transcended their brief and unpleasant encounter on the bus. Harold nodded slowly, his expression softening. I knew some good men in the 173rd, he said. They fought with honor. Roger swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. So I've been told, he replied. Would you consider my offer? Just for tonight, at least. It's supposed to get down to the 40s. Harold looked from Roger to Robert and back again, as if weighing not just the offer but the intentions behind it. My wife will have my hide if I don't bring you home for dinner now, Roger added with a nervous laugh. She's big on hospitality, southern roots, you know. Harold's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Well, he said slowly, I wouldn't want to cause trouble between a man and his wife. He hesitated, then added, one night, maybe, if you're sure. Roger's face broke into a relieved smile. Absolutely sure. My car's in the parking garage just down the block. And I promise, my wife's cooking is worth any awkwardness. As they began walking toward the parking garage, Robert felt strangely reluctant to part ways with them. Mr. Winters, he called, causing both men to pause and turn. I'd like to stay in touch, if that's all right with you. Maybe I could stop by tomorrow? He wasn't entirely sure why he was making this offer. He hardly knew either of these men, but something about Harold's quiet dignity and the unexpected turn of events had affected him deeply. Harold studied him for a moment before nodding. I'd like that, son, he said simply. Roger pulled out a business card and handed it to Robert. Here's my contact information. Call me tomorrow, and I'll let you know how things are going. He glanced at Harold, who was gazing up at the darkening sky. Something tells me this is the beginning of an interesting friendship for all of us. Robert took the card, slipping it into his wallet with care. I believe you're right, he replied, feeling strangely moved by the unexpected connection forming between three strangers on a city street as twilight descended around them. Harold set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. Why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do all this for a stranger? I haven't done anything to deserve such kindness. Megan reached across the table and placed her hand over his. You served your country, Mr. Winters. You put your life on the line for people you didn't know. If that doesn't deserve kindness, I don't know what does. Harold looked down at her hand covering his vision blurring slightly. I was just doing my duty, he murmured. The doorbell rang, interrupting the emotional moment. That must be Robert, Roger said, rising to answer it. Moments later, he returned with Robert Chin in tow. Robert's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Harold, clean, rested, and sitting at a kitchen table like he belonged there. Mr. Winters, he said, breaking into a smile. You look well. Harold nodded, returning the smile with a small one of his own. Amazing what a hot shower and a good night's sleep can do, he replied. He gestured to the chair beside him. Join us? Megan makes a mean cup of coffee. As Robert took a seat, Harold looked around at the three faces turned toward him, strangers just a day ago, now offering him not just shelter and employment, but dignity and respect, something he hadn't felt in far too long. He cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. I've been on my own for a long time, he began slowly. After Vietnam, things were difficult. My wife couldn't handle what the war had done to me. Can't say I blame her. I wasn't the same man who left. Started drinking. Lost my job, then the house. Been on the streets off and on for years. Figured that's where I'd end up dying someday. Megan's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. Harold continued, his voice growing stronger. Yesterday on that bus, When everyone was looking at me like I was less than human, I thought it was just another bad day in a long string of bad days. Never imagined it would lead to this. He gestured around the kitchen, at the home and the people who had, for reasons he still couldn't fully comprehend, decided to welcome him into their lives. I'm not sure I deserve all this, but I'm grateful. And if you're serious about the job and the room, I promise I won't let you down. Roger nodded, his expression solemn. We're serious, Harold, and we know you won't let us down. Robert leaned forward, his eyes bright with an idea. I have some contacts at a veteran support group. They help with counseling, social events, that sort of thing. Would you be interested in connecting with other vets? Harold hesitated only briefly before nodding. Might be good to be around people who understand, he admitted. Been keeping to myself for too long. As the conversation continued, plans being made and ideas exchanged, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Hope, not just for shelter or employment, but for connection, for belonging, for purpose. The journey wouldn't be easy. Decades of hardship and solitude had left their mark on him, both visible and invisible. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't facing that journey alone, and that, perhaps, made all the difference. 6 months later, Harold Winters stood before a group of veterans at the community center, sharing his story. He spoke of his time in service, the struggles that followed, the years spent on the streets, and the day a chance encounter on a city bus changed everything. He was neatly dressed now, his beard trimmed, his eyes clear and focused. He had a job, a room of his own in the Blackwell home, and something he never expected to find again. A family, not of blood but of choice. Sometimes dignity comes from the most unexpected places, he told the attentive faces before him. Sometimes it takes a stranger seeing your worth when you've forgotten it yourself. In the back of the room, Robert and Roger exchanged glances, both knowing that in helping Harold rediscover his dignity, they had found something equally valuable, a reminder of their own humanity, their capacity for compassion, and the profound difference that simple kindness could make in a world too often defined by indifference. Thank you for listening to this story. If you like it, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story of Narrative Whispers.